Hi, this is Tim Weber from South Texas College, and today we're going to have a look at a bit of middle childhood. This would be ages 6 through 11 or so, and some aspects of psychological and social development during that time period. And you can see a list of some of the topics that we'll be looking at. We'll be looking at sort of the nature of children at this point in time. We'll also be looking at the influence of families and children as well. The following video after this one will pick up the peer group and moral development. So let's get right into it. So middle childhood, this age group from say 6 through 11, children are developing many psychological traits and social traits that will enable them to move towards adolescence and eventually adulthood. They're becoming more independent. So in middle childhood, the child doesn't have to have their parents do so many things for them as they did when they were in early childhood. And they desire to be more independent and do things more on their own as well. They also are developing deeper friendships at this point in time, less superficial than when they were in early childhood. And they are also beginning to understand many of the social complexities and how some of the nuances of how to interact with other people in an appropriate and effective way. They also are forming values as well during this time, which we'll look at later. And they're developing various coping strategies and inner strengths to overcome difficulties as well as to enable them to solve problems that they encounter. And again, these strategies and strengths will enable them to progress into adolescence and adulthood more effectively. So when we look at some of the classic theories on middle childhood, Freud looked at middle childhood as a latency period. You might remember his psychosexual stages, and he believed that during this time, the sexual urges sort of died down and became dormant, and that early childhood conflicts were repressed during this time. And so this time of relative calm psychically, the child was able to learn the various skills and things that were valued in their culture without the interference of these conflicts and urges. When we look at Erikson's theory, Erikson sees the child at this point dealing with the issue of industry versus inferiority. So industry, this would be the desire to be competent in whatever their culture values. So the child who can develop the skills and things that are valued in their culture has this sense of industry, that they're up to things, they're up to the task, that they're going to fit in, they're going to be able to make it. Now, on the other hand, if the child is not able to develop these abilities, then they feel inferior. They feel like they're not good enough, that there's something wrong with them. Now, the particular abilities that are involved here can vary greatly from one culture to another. If your culture values learning various traditional dances highly, like you see in the picture above, and musical performances, those will be the things that the child is going to want to become competent in and will feel inferior if they're unable to cope with that and able to develop those abilities. Now, here in the US, what do we commonly expect children to become competent at during this time period? Well, our society has a strong sense that the child should be developing the ability to handle academic work like reading and writing and arithmetic, all that stuff. So if the child gets into school and they cannot succeed, they aren't able to develop that competence, then they will feel inferior. They will feel that they're not good enough and that there's something wrong with them. Okay, now there's other things, of course, as well. What do we value in every culture? The ability to have and make friends and keep them. Again, if the child fails miserably at that, that sense of industry is lost. They feel inferior. They feel like they're not ready for what's coming at the next step. So a lot of things that we can learn by looking at this. One of the things we have to recognize is we need to help children actually develop these competencies and find ways for kids that are having trouble and struggling with them to actually be successful in that. And we also have to maybe reassure kids that maybe aren't able to develop some of these valued abilities, reassure them that they still have value, even if they're having difficulties with school or difficulties making friends and so forth. Okay, so the child's self-concept also is developing as well, okay? And their self-concept is changing from what it was in early childhood. It no longer mirrors their parents' perspective. In early childhood, kids really think very highly of themselves, and in a great extent, it's because, well, parents will tell them, you're great, you're wonderful, and so they accept that, and their view mirrors what their parents are telling them. But as they get into middle childhood, kids begin to feel like, well, they know themselves better than the adults around them do, including their parents. And so they begin to engage in self-criticism and become more self-conscious. And there's probably another thing in play. They're being evaluated now by people other than their parents. They're being evaluated by their teachers at school. They're being evaluated by the other kids at school. And it matters more to them what their peers think now. And so there's a lot of room to receive criticism and to take that as being accurate. So in general, what we'll see is self-confidence tends to decrease during these years, whereas inhibition, which is the hesitancy to try something new and different, tends to increase. In fact, you can see it here on this chart, and you can see that, yeah, when it comes to confidence, as kids are going through this time period, they're less confident. They also tend to be more inhibited as they go through this time period. They're more afraid to try something new, to engage in new situations for fear that maybe they won't succeed. So there is a difference in how they see themselves as compared to early childhood. Early childhood, overly positive self-concept, now a little bit more reserved in their self-concept. We also can look at self-esteem in middle childhood. So self-esteem is, you know, how you see yourself in terms of your value, your worth. And we can look at extremes when it comes to self-esteem. Extremely, excessively high self-esteem or excessively low self-esteem. Both of these extremes can be damaging. Unrealistic self-esteem at either extreme reduces effort, reduces achievement. And you say, well, how so? Okay, if you have excessively low self-esteem, unrealistically low self-esteem, what do you begin to think about yourself? I'm no good. I'm worthless. I can't do anything. Could you learn that? No, I couldn't do that. And so the child simply doesn't make an effort, assuming that they're going to fail. And so their achievement then suffers as a result. Now, at the other extreme, unrealistically high self-esteem, this also is detrimental in terms of effort. Child looks at, do I need to make an effort? No, I'm the greatest already. Why should I put any effort into improving myself? I'm already the greatest. And in terms of achievement, no. They're going to say, well, if I don't have to prove anything. I'm the greatest already. And as you look at this, there's another thing. Unrealistically high self-esteem also prevents kids from learning from their mistakes. So with normal levels of self-esteem, you make a mistake and you think, hey, you know what? Maybe I did something wrong and maybe I could correct that and next time I'll do better. But if you got unrealistically high self-esteem, what's your assumption when something goes wrong? Not my fault. I'm the greatest. So whose fault is it? Well, it must be somebody else. It must be some condition, somebody else, not me. So you don't learn to take responsibility for your mistakes and learn from them with unrealistically high self-esteem. Also, kids that have inflated self-esteem and again, unrealistically high self-esteem are more prone to act aggressively towards others, particularly other children. And this is especially dangerous when that inflated self-esteem is combined with a low opinion of other kids. So if you think you're the greatest and other kids are, just dirt, yeah, why not mistreat them? You can see how that can contribute to aggressive behavior. So obviously, more realistic self-evaluation is better. So moderate levels of self-esteem. So um, sometimes kids then need some help in improving on their self-esteem, whether it's excessively high or low. And sometimes friends will help them improve their self-concept and see themselves more as they are, feedback from their friends. So having good relationships with other kids can be helpful. They've also found that participation in after-school activities, especially if it involves team sports that are properly supervised, can be beneficial too. It kind of helps kids get a better sense of, who they are and kind of how they fit in. So those things can be helpful. Now, just a little aside, when we talk about self-esteem, this is kind of really was sort of an American invention, if you will, 30 years ago or so, maybe give or take. And self-esteem, this whole idea became popular, and there were many misconceptions about it, and still are, and many myths about self-esteem. One of the myths was that, well, if somebody wasn't doing well, then all you had to do is boost up their self-esteem and they would do better. If they were doing mean things, boost their self-esteem and then they'll act better. Or if they were doing badly in school, well, bolster up their self-esteem and then they'll do better. Well, that's not exactly true. Um, for example, they've done studies of college students. And what they found is that college students' self-esteem and self-concept is considerably more positive than it was a couple decades ago. However, performance in college courses and on standardized tests, really not better. So simple improvements in self-esteem didn't lead to improvements in performance automatically. Now, that said, again, at the extremes, this may actually may have some point. If you do have a child that does extremely low self-esteem, again, they may be hesitant to even try to improve themselves They may assume that they're going to fail and not even try very hard. So extremely low self-esteem, yes, if we can help them bring that self-esteem up, now they're maybe going to feel that, hey, maybe I could do it. Let me try. Yeah. So there is something to that where there is excessively low self-esteem, but in general, it doesn't seem to do much good just to boost people's self-esteem. Now, we also should know, whereas in the US here, we tend to think that high self-esteem is good, there's other culture groups that have very different views. And in fact, they would say, no, you shouldn't think too highly of yourself. You really ought to have a very modest view of yourself. And if you go into that culture group with, even normal levels of self-esteem that we'd have here, it might be viewed as be excessive self-occupation, that sort of thing. So you have to sort of look at the cultural situation. So I think probably one of the things that we could say is, culturally acceptable self-esteem may be more important than the actual level. Um, so that's just a little aside on that topic. So one of the things that kids are then developing is the abilities and skills they need to become resilient and to overcome significant stressors. So resilience then is the ability to adapt well despite significant adversities and the ability to overcome serious stressors. So when we're talking about resilience, first of all, to demonstrate that there has to be some adversity that's encountered, significant adversity, things that might overwhelm a child's peers. So that's part of demonstrating resilience. And resilience also then is the person has made some positive adaptation to a stressor or stressful situation. So to give you an example, maybe we have a child whose family is very poor, very low income. And that's a significant adversity. If you didn't know that, yeah, it's for real. Um, However, the child may demonstrate resilience by really making an effort to succeed in school in spite of the difficulties that that poverty is placing in front of them. And they may look at that poverty actually as having given them some abilities and skills that other kids haven't developed. They may say, you know what? Yeah, we're really poor and it's hard, but you know what? We know what to do if we don't have electricity. We know how to get by without that. We know how to get by when your car doesn't run. We know how to get by on very little money. And we have skills that other kids who are more well-to-do don't have. And so that viewpoint then enables that child to adapt more positively to the situation. And at the same time, they may say, but you know what? I'm going to see if I can do well in school because this is hard, even though I've learned a lot by it and I know things that other kids don't. I'm going to really try to do well so that I can make things easier for my family. So there you see a positive adaptation to that stressor. Now, resilience is also dynamic. In other words, it varies depending upon the situation. And so children may be somewhat more resilient at certain points in middle childhood, where it may become more evident as well. So a child may be resilient at one point and able to overcome a difficult stressor, but at another point they may not have the resources for it. So keep that in mind. Now, the stressors that the child may encounter then may be one-time events, or they may be ongoing. They may be one single stressor, or they may be accumulating stressors. And each of these has differing impacts on children. So when it comes to an ongoing stressor versus a single event, Single events can be very traumatic. However, usually where the stressor is ongoing and long term, it will tend to have produce more difficulty. So it's more difficult for a child, say, to live with poverty every day than it is to have a month where the family had a terrible financial setback. You can see how that's different. Um, Also, it tends to be conditions that impact children daily that are more difficult to cope with. So things the child has to deal with every day. For example, if mom is depressed, every day the child has to somehow get through that, and sometimes has to take over things that mom ordinarily would be doing. If one has an alcoholic parent, again, every day one has to deal with that and the outcomes of that. Or how about this one? Homelessness, something that can be ongoing and again impacts the child every day in what they do. So these again that impact daily tend to be more difficult than single one-time things. Now we can also look at the effects of stressors as they accumulate. So back when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans some years ago, they looked at some of the outcomes for children. And many children had multiple stressors that occurred as a result of that hurricane. Some had their homes damaged in the storm. Some had to actually move to somewhere else, a lot of them actually. Many of them were separated from a primary caregiver, a parent or grandparent that took care of them. Many of them had to transfer to a new school. Some of them had lost a family member or friend in the hurricane. And quite a few of them had a parent now who was unemployed as a result of the hurricane. And even a good number of these kids had been separated from a very valued pet. So each of those things might be very difficult to deal with, but imagine the difficulty if you had to deal with several of these stressors at once. As stressors accumulate, they become more difficult to tolerate. And indeed, they found that children who dealt with more stressors as they accumulated, the rates of child psychological problems tended to increase as the child was having to deal with more difficulties. So what are some of the skills that children are developing in middle childhood then that enable them to cope with difficult situations, stressors, and adversities? The first on our list is called the development of cognitive coping. So cognitive, how are they processing information? How are they interpreting their situation? How are they seeing what's going on in their life? So the interpretation matters. And one case in point, there was one study that looked at the effects of family environment as well as the perception of poverty, all of these families being in poverty. And what they found is that the highest levels of cortisol, which is a stress hormone, were found in kids who had a chaotic family environment, and also where that poverty was seen as a threat to them. That produced the highest cortisol response. Now, on the other hand, where there was a low self sense of threat and stable family, you did not see increased levels of cortisol. If you had a chaotic family, but there was a low sense of threat regarding poverty, you did not see the excessively increased levels of cortisol. So how the child thought about the poverty had a great deal of influence on just how it affected them, even physically. terms of stress. Now, another area of cognitive coping is attributions. So attributions are how do you explain the things that happen to you, okay? Now, in the case of what we're looking at, adversities and problems that are occurring, we'll look at attributions about these kinds of difficulties. So in looking at this, if the child looks at it, who and what is to blame? If they say to themselves, you know what, it's personal. There's something wrong with me, and that's why this bad thing has happened, or that's why I'm having this adversity. It's my fault. They tend to have more difficulty coping with it. On the other hand, if they can point to somebody else and say, you know what, it's not my fault, it happened because somebody else made an error, mistake, or there's something outside of me to blame, they tended to be able to cope with it better, okay, in general, okay. That's aside for, if it's your fault, should you take some responsibility, but in general, and for example, if parents are, they're divorcing, a lot of kids will blame themselves and they'll say, oh, it's my fault. If I had just behaved better, my parents wouldn't be fighting and arguing and talking about divorce. That child will have a more difficult time coping with the fact that their parents might be breaking up than if they actually say, well, it's not me that's the cause. It's a lot harder when you see yourself as the cause of the problem. Secondly, attributions as to whether the problem is permanent or temporary. So if the child sees the problem as permanent, they're going to have a lot harder time coping with it than if they see it as temporary, okay? So maybe the child has had some difficulty with friends. If they say, oh my gosh, this is permanent, I'm not going to have any friends forever, they're going to have a harder time coping with it if they say, well, I'll find other friends, it's just temporary. The third type of attribution has to do with just what's the scope of the problem, or how do they see the scope of the problem. So, if they look at the problem that they're facing and they see it as being global, that it has ruined everything in their whole life, pervasive is another word, then they're going to have more difficulty coping with the situation than if they say, you know what, this problem, it is giving me some difficulty in this area of my life, but there's other areas of my life that things aren't so bad. And some areas, maybe even things are good. And so how you see it, your attributions make a big difference. And by the way, this is not just in middle childhood, this is really lifelong, isn't it? So even the experience of parentification is influenced by the child's interpretation and cognitions about it. Now, parentification is where the child feels that they need to take over some of the duties that normally a parent would do. So maybe the child, for some reason or another, feels they must be the one that takes care of their brothers or sisters. Maybe they feel like they have to take care of interaction with people in the community. Maybe they feel like they have to cover for the parent when the boss calls and says, why isn't the parent, why aren't they at work, whatever. So parentification is hard on kids. And it interferes with their ability to go out and play with their friends, develop friends, because they're kind of stuck at home doing what their parents should be doing. So that's really difficult. Just when they need to develop those relationships with their peers, this can interfere with that. And not to mention that they're often trying to handle things that are really beyond their capabilities, or that really stretch their capabilities to the maximum. Now, it turns out that even though parentification is generally um, detrimental to development in childhood, it does depend somewhat on whether it's voluntary or involuntary. You know, if the child looks at it and they feel that they've just been forced into covering for their parents, then this will tend to be more detrimental than if they see it as being voluntary and that they just, you know, they felt the need and they wanted to help in their family. It tends to be less um, less detrimental. Involuntary tends to be more detrimental. Okay, now another coping mechanism that kids may develop to cope with difficulties is escaping home. Now, I have to be a little careful here. So, are we talking about running away from home? Well, some kids do actually do that. That said, is this usually a good solution for a problem that's at home? Not usually. Okay. In fact, that can be a very dangerous thing. A kid at this age, out on the street, wow, they could be subject to all sorts of dangers and hazards. That's really not a very good solution. However, maybe if it involves spending time away from home, if that's where the problem is, with friends, spending more time with their friends or with extended family. So maybe with their tío, you know, spending some time over there with them, um, grandma or grandpa, these things. Yeah, sometimes that can be beneficial, safe environment where they can sort of, for a time, escape some of the problems if they are problems at home. Now, involvement in community, church, or after school programs also may provide an outlet where a child who's having difficulties at home can spend more time there and serves as a distraction as well as enables them to escape the difficulties for some time and then cope with them and face them more effectively when they need to. And in some cases, education can be an escape from difficulties. So a child that is having difficulties at home might throw themselves into doing the best they can in school, and it keeps their attention off the problems at home and gives them a sense of accomplishment to sort of help them get through it, or developing various interests, like maybe getting really good at some sports and spending a lot of time on that, or what have you, can be sort of an escape, again, a distraction that enables them to spend some time thinking about something else until they're strong enough to face the difficulties. Now, we've kind of focused on, you know, problems that are home, but these things also can be where there's a problem that is not in their home, still spending time with others and activities that are positive that they can have a diversion from the problem can help them to get by on a day-to-day basis. Our third avenue of coping, social support, and I'm going to say this is probably the most key of them all. And so support from others can help the child overcome that adversity and get through difficult times. The first line of defense would be a loving and consistently available parent. And for children who have that, that's a very positive thing. Also, supportive relatives. In fact, there's some research that indicates that having a very close network of supportive relatives may be as important as that consistently available parent that cares. Third area of support would include the child's friends and peers. And so they can be relied upon to be supportive as the child tries to get through that difficult time. And then we have also unrelated adults. Okay, sometimes these are the people that make the difference for the child that's having trouble. You know, maybe it's a teacher or a coach or a neighbor that sees the child as having some difficulties and sort of, gives them a bit of extra attention and maybe helps them to work through it. Sometimes these individuals can make a huge difference in the child's life. And even pets might be considered a part of the child's social support. Sometimes when the child doesn't know where else to turn, just a supportive pet that always seems to love them can go a long ways to getting through things. Now, here's a statement that I liked that was in the textbook previously. Um, they said that people are mostly self-righting. What that means is I don't know if you've heard of these boats, like canoes, that they're self-righting. In other words, if you tip it over in the water, like it will turn itself right side up again by itself. And this author said, well, people are mostly self-righting, but they must connect with at least one other for this to happen. And I think that's a really good statement, because yeah, it seems that people often can overcome almost anything if they just have one other person that really cares. If they have that, you can throw almost anything at them and they can get through it. Now, the converse, I think, is also important to think about. The person that doesn't have one other person that they can rely on for support, that has no one that cares, no one that will give them the time of day, yeah, how likely are they to cope with serious problems? They are greatly handicapped. Now, I've had a lot of students, I know there's a lot, but a few students in class, and they'll say, yeah, but you know what, this terrible thing happened. And they've told me some terrible, terrible things that happened to me when I was a child. But you know what, I got through it. Nobody helped me. Um, but often if I get them to think a little bit more deeply, they'll begin to remember, you know what, yeah, but there was that one person or certain people who actually did make a bit of a difference, and it was enough that I could grasp onto that support and I could get through it. So even then, if we dig around, often we're going to find, yeah, it did really depend on having that support of at least one other person. So please don't downplay this at all. It's kind of key. So every child needs at least one other person that cares about them and is available to them for support. Okay, then we have also the potential of religious faith to enable children to cope effectively with difficulties and adversity. Now, there have been studies that have looked at this and identified that this, in fact, can be very beneficial. And when looking into some of the reasons why, here's some reasons why. First of all, as a person engages in activities related to that religious faith, often they receive social support from others. And they have often trusting interactions with others as well. Maybe there are situations where they can't trust certain people in their lives, but in engaging in that religious faith, they run into people that are trustworthy and supportive. Also, the elements of that religious faith may be psychologically protective. So the ideas of that faith may help them reinterpret their experiences in a way that can be beneficial. So, for example, I'm speaking, my background is I'm Christian, so I'm speaking from a Christian perspective because that's what I know. There are other religious faiths that may deal with this differently. But concepts like sin and grace and salvation can help kids make sense of the world. Say, well, why are we having these problems? It's not my fault. Well, yeah, there's sin in the world, and people do things that hurt other people. But you know what? There is there is salvation, and you know what? People can be forgiven, and even if we fail, we can be forgiven. That can help them kind of make sense of difficulties. Also, some of those beliefs may benefit. For example, there was one study in which children in all walks of life were asked about if you're having difficulty, would praying about it be helpful to you? And majority of the kids said, yeah, I think it would be helpful. Now, that said, in the same study, many of those kids didn't believe that the prayer would necessarily make things different, but just that it would somehow help them to cope with the difficulty. I thought that was interesting. They also found that as people engage in religious faith, many religious faiths, including mine, really stress unconditional acceptance, that we are all valuable in God's eyes, and that we must accept others, even those very different from others. Yeah, even those are very difficult, because we're not all that perfect either, you know? And so an experience that unconditional acceptance, even if you're poor, even if maybe you look different than the other kids, or you can't do math, whatever, that gives the child a sense of self-worth. And some of those beliefs of that religious faith may also um, sort of stress that as well. And again, from the perspective that I have, the Christian faith, which I'm familiar with, we're told that, yeah, you know what, you are valuable. God created you, in fact, in whatever way He did that. And in fact, He was willing to even sacrifice Himself for your benefit. So you are extremely, totally valuable to Him. So, looking at that, that can give the child a sense that, oh, I do have value, even. Yeah. So, now, having said all this about religious faith, I'm going to kind of go out on a limb and say a couple other things. Is, there are also, I think, some toxic religious ideas. I'm not going to say necessarily religious faith, but some toxic religious ideas. If we have a religion that tells people that, you know what, you're just dirt, and that you have no value, uh, that's probably not going to be beneficial. If we have a religious faith that is causing people to look down on others, and to, say that, well, some people are worthy of acceptance, but not others, or that is promoting hate for various groups, mistreatment of certain groups of people. That's not beneficial, and that's not what we're talking about here. Obviously, there are some religious groups that are actually promoting ideas that are not beneficial for kids when they have difficulties. So take that also as something to be aware of. Okay. So as we look at then sort of the next area, look at how the family influences the child's experience in middle childhood. What we can say is generally kids will develop well if their family provides these 5 essential functions for their children. Okay, regardless of the structure of the family, whether it's a one parent family, 2-parent family, what have you, if the family provides these things, kids develop well generally. And what are they? Number 1, physical necessities. Okay, so providing what? Food, clothing, medical care, shelter that kids need. That's kind of a given, okay? Secondly, promoting learning. So whether that be going to school or learning what's necessary in the person's cultural situation, that can take a lot of forms. You say, well, how does the family do that? Well, One of the ways, at least here in the US, is just seeing that the child goes to school, that the child is actually engaged in school. And that could also involve maybe what? Maybe helping the child with their homework, not doing it for them, but helping them with it. It might involve making sure that the child actually gets to school. It might involve spending some time actually asking the child, hey, what are you learning in school? And actually seriously wanting to see what they could tell you. Going to parent and teacher conferences, so being involved with the child's education where the family can, maybe providing some extra learning opportunities as well. That's great if they can. Contributes to that. So there's a lot of ways families are important for the child to learn what they need to uh, thrive in our society. Thirdly, for the development of self-respect. So the family that helps the child to develop reasonable levels of self-esteem and a realistic self-concept and a sense of self-worth, that's really important. And of course, we do see families where the opposite may occur and where they encourage the child to see themselves as worthless. That's the antithesis to this, obviously. So you can see how important that is. Also, children need relationships with their peers. So the opportunity to develop friendships with other kids, to interact with other kids effectively. Now, how does the family play a part in that? Well, for one thing, families can give the child opportunities to attend events where they can interact with other kids, or the family might make their home a place that's inviting for the child to actually bring their friends home, spend time with their friends right there in their home. So that's really important as well. Um, oh yeah, and not restricting the child so much that they can't spend some time with their friends, right? But giving them times when, yeah, they can go out and play with their friends. Okay, number 5, harmony and stability. So this is, the child needs a sense that when they're at home, things are going to be relatively peaceful and the situation will be stable. So, that you can count on certain things being consistently a certain way, okay, rather than, you never know when you're going to get something to eat, or if you do, or you're never going to know who are the people that are going to be there as part of your family, or where your family's living next week. Yeah, so they prefer stability and it benefits them. Okay, now I hate to surprise you, but in truth, no family is perfect. Okay, that said, there are some family dysfunctions that are worse than others. The family that doesn't provide some of these, okay, that kind of dysfunction tends to be more significant, or dysfunctions that are, again, very intense stressors, like the child having to deal with homelessness, for example, and tremendous instability, or very serious um, family conflict like domestic violence. That dysfunction is somewhat worse than maybe some mild conflict. Also, some dysfunctions within families are worse at some times than others. So being restricted from spending time with your peers and developing friendships is probably going to be more of a problem to the child when they're just getting into middle school than it is when they're in second grade. It's when you get into middle school, those relationships with your peers become almost the main thing on your radar. So, we have to look at all of these things in trying to evaluate how family is functioning and what effect it's going to have on the child. How difficult is it for them to cope with it? So there are many different family structures, and again, I want to stress that it's more important that we look at how is the family fulfilling these 5 things here, um, than what kind of family is it. Um, each of these family structures can indeed do all of those things effectively. It may be easier for some than others. So just what kinds of family structures do we have? Well, here's some basic ones. You've got 2-parent families. Um, we have both parents, whether that is parents are cohabitating rather than married, or married parents. This can be an adoptive 2-parent family. Child is adopted. This can be a grandparent family where both grandparents are parenting the child, or a step-parent family where you have 2 parents. Okay, so all kinds of forms of 2-parent families. More than half kids are in 2-parent families at any point in time. Okay, so still pretty prevalent. The nuclear family is actually a type of 2-parent family where you have both biological parents and their biological children. Studies have indicated that that tends to provide the most advantages to kids of any family structure, and we'll look at why in a minute. We have adoptive 2-parent families, and again, these often can provide very similar benefits to kids who have their biological parents. We have same-sex parent families. That's currently less than 1% of families. Some of the results are controversial, but I think, again, if we look at those 5 family functions, if they can do that well, chances are kids will do okay. Step families. So here we have where one of the parents is the child's biological parent, and the other parent is a step parent, not their biological parent. And these families, they tend to do best for kids if they have come into that step family situation before age 3 or so. So if it happens very early in their childhood, they tend to really adapt to it well, generally. In fact, that step parent may be, for all practical purposes, the only mom or dad that they knew. They may not even know that biological parent at all, or not well. On the other hand, these step families tend to be toughest if you come into that step family as a teenager, because then you're dealing with, your biological parent, and you're used to them, and now you have this other step parent who's making the rules for you, and maybe so on. You could just see the problems that'll happen. And hey, wait a minute, you're not really my parent. So teenagers are pretty smart that way. Anyway, but that again, results will vary depending on the situation. Blended families. Blended families are where you have 2 parents who each have their own children, own biological children, that are brought into this blended family. So mom has her kids, dad has her kids, and then you may have them having their own kids together, and having their biological kids as part of that family. And this makes for a much more complex relationships in the family, tends to be more stressful for kids, and there's all sorts of disagreements that may come up as a result of some of the dynamics in that family. These tend to be more difficult for kids. Second marriages also, which at least one of the parents is often going to have, more vulnerable to divorce. So these families, blended families, tend to dissolve more often than some of the other types. So all in all, can be difficult. Having said that, some blended families do a wonderful job for all of the kids that are in that family. It just varies depending upon how they deal with it. Okay. So to the question of why do nuclear families, biological parents with their biological children, generally function the best? And here are a number of reasons. One is that you have a parental alliance. Both parents are working together for their children's welfare. Both of them, those are their flesh and blood, if you will. And so they are more apt to cooperate in order that their children can do well. Also, in these nuclear families, abuse and neglect of the child is less likely to occur. In nuclear families, you tend to see more emotional maturity than in other family structures. It is difficult to keep together a marriage and a family over the lifetime of raising your child. And so that requires some emotional maturity. If you don't have it, chances are that nuclear family breaks up. So keep that together. They're going to tend to have more emotional maturity. Also, nuclear families, the parents tend to have more education, which benefits them. The parents' health tend to be better, and family incomes tend to be higher. So all of those things enable the family to provide a bit more for kids. They also make it easier on the parents, makes it where the parent is less likely to have to work extremely long hours. It makes it less likely that the family is going to be struggling to provide basic needs, less likely that parents are going to be stressed over problems of income, health, and so forth. So that benefits the child. And parents in nuclear families generally are more available to their children because of some of these other factors. They tend to have more time to spend with each child. So those are some things that say, well, if at all possible, nuclear family tends to be what we want for kids. Okay. In a perfect world, we'd all have that. Okay. Now, single parent families, I should back up. In a perfect world, yes, unless you have one of those parents is an extremely bad problem. Okay, I will admit that there are some situations where, yeah, one of the parents has such significant problems that that family might function better as a single parent family. But barring that, okay, yeah. So single parent families, you've got one parent and their child, or maybe numerous children. And a lot of kids spend some time in a single parent family, about 40% of kids last time I looked. So, it's very common to spend some time in that type of family. Generally speaking, it's more difficult for single parent families to provide what kids need and to be successful with that, but outcomes vary. And we'll talk about some of the reasons why in a bit. But know that, yes, tends to be more difficult whether you're the parent or the child, either side of that. Why? Well, for one thing, single parent families are more likely to be low income. And so simply making ends meet may be a big concern in a single parent family. Also, single parent families tend to be less stable than two parent families. They're more likely to have changes in who is part of the family, maybe a new parental figure coming in or leaving more often. They're more likely to move to a new location, also more likely to have job changes on the part of the parent. That makes it more difficult. The single parent often has to play multiple roles. There's not both mom and dad, so they have to play both parts. They often are going to be the sole breadwinner in that single parent family, whereas two parent families may have two incomes. And so this often puts a greater amount of stress on that single parent. And and trying to do all of these things and still make sure that their child has what they need. As a result of all that, often there is less individual attention available per child because of all the stresses of dealing with income and so forth. So what they find is that kids of single parent families are at somewhat higher risk of school problems, as well as even problems that may persist into adulthood. Now, having said that, if you're a child in a single parent family, that doesn't necessarily mean you're doomed to, bad things happening in your family and having problems like that in school as an adult. A lot of factors come into play. If that single parent family has significant income, that's going to relieve a lot of stress and enable a lot of things. Or if that single parent family has the assistance of maybe other relatives who can help care for the child, or who can help with maybe providing some housing. So even if there's not that much income, then there's at least a nice, decent place to live. And the parent doesn't have to be as stressed about producing more income to have a decent place to live. Again, that's a factor. And then there's just also, I think, probably just awareness. If the single parent is aware that it's important that they find some way to give each child significant attention and to somehow fill in the gaps for those roles that they may not be able to play themselves, again, they may be able to do a better job. So it just varies. And yeah, I think about this and I think, wow, how hard it must be to be a single parent. And we need to recognize that and not assume that every family is the same. Okay. We also have the extended family. And so here you might have, mom and dad and their kids, and then in the same household, or maybe next door nearby, you might have grandma and grandpa, aunts and uncles, cousins, you name it. So extended family actually can provide some benefits for kids. The extended family can share expenses, and often there are more people who can provide income in that extended family. And so that can kind of provide a sort of higher standard of learning for the child. And also responsibilities can be shared. So maybe the parents have to be out working when kids get home from school, but hey, grandma or aunt or uncle is there when the kids get home from school and able to give them some attention and what they need. So really can be a very beneficial thing, providing a broader support network for kids. And so, yeah, when the child's maybe having some difficulties, maybe they don't want to talk about mom or dad, but maybe they can go talk to, their aunt or uncle or one of their cousins about it, right? And it just more built-in support, you might say. So now there's some cultural and economic factors here, more prevalent in many cultures. I know here in the Rio Grande Valley, in Hispanic culture, extended family tends to be more common, even in my household. And also economic factors. And again, whereas there does tend to be some lower income associated with extended families, often the fact that there are more people producing income and the sharing of expenses kind of offsets that. Okay, so there you go. All right, and polygamous families. Now you might think, come on, we don't have that here. We don't, but there are some places in the world where this is actually quite common. Okay, so what are we talking about? Talking about a family where it's usually a matter of plural wives, where a man might have more than one wife, and of course then their offspring. So what we see, generally speaking, and they study these polygamous families, is outcomes are usually poorer for kids. Kids don't do as well. Kids tend to have more behavioral problems. Um, so in general, they don't seem to be really one of the best structures. And even in parts of the world where it's common, don't seem to be as advantageous as the two-parent kind of family. So, okay, there you go. If you go other places in the world, you may encounter that. Be prepared for it. Okay, now, when it comes to family dysfunction, the family not providing one of those things that we saw there, not providing what the child needs, here are some factors that increase the likelihood of family dysfunction. One is lack of income. Second one is instability. Third is family conflict. So let's get a little detail here. Okay, when it comes to low income, it helps to have a look at the family stress model. And so the family stress model says as the number of stresses and the severity of them piles up, the greater the effects. So the negative effects depend on just how many stressors there are, how intense. Now, what does that have to do with low income? Well, if you're living in poverty, that's not just one stressor, that's a whole boatload of stressors. Because when you're living in poverty, yeah, you don't have enough money. You have to work more to try to get your income up. You're worried about how you're going to pay for the next month's rent. You might have to move soon. You're never sure if you're going to be able to afford the electric bill, and so on. Now I'm giving extreme poverty, but you get the idea. And if you're a child and your family's poor, maybe the clothes that you have are hand-me-down clothes. Um, you know, and that's sort of stressful because the other kids, they notice that they're sort of old-fashioned, and then your place you live is maybe not that nice, so you're kind of embarrassed maybe to bring other people over there. There's all kinds of stressors that go along with poverty that people don't think about. And so poverty is not just one stressor, but a whole boatload of them. So that said, the effect of poverty varies significantly depending upon other factors. For example, maybe you have a one-parent family and there's not much income. That one parent can't provide much, but if there's child support from another parent outside that single-parent family, then that poverty might not be as significant a stressor. Okay. When it comes to low income, the parent's reaction to it matters as well. If the parents always make a big deal about it that we're poor and you can't be this, you can't be that because we're poor, you're never going to succeed because we're poor, that's going to be a real difficult stressor for that child, as opposed to the parent saying, you know what, yeah, we don't have as much, but it's not a big deal. We'll get by. We have each other, and we're going to make sure you guys get a good education, and you know what, things can be better. The parent's reaction matters. If it gives the child hope, or if it's just they paint a dismal picture of life, right? Now, that said, when we have lack of income, there are some tendencies that are pretty prevalent. Okay, they find that parents tend to communicate less with their children in low-income families. They tend to use harsher punishments. Okay, tend to use harsh punishment more often. You say, well, why is that? Well, the parent may be so busy trying to make both ends meet, working so much that they don't have time to communicate. They may be tired or stressed or depressed. And in terms of harsh punishment, there are kind of two things there. One, they're maybe going to say, I don't have the patience to use a less harsh means of discipline. I'm just too tired from working too much. Um, or they may feel that they have to be harsh to make sure the child provides proper standards of behavior outside the home, and they're more concerned about that. So that's a tendency. Now, some people then suggested that, well, maybe then in low income families, what we need to do is we need to give those parents parental training. I'm going to tell you about some research that suggests that maybe that's not the problem. Okay. Maybe the problem is actually that we need to work at alleviating poverty. Now, let me give you a case in point. There was an Indian reservation that had very high rates of unemployment, very low income, a lot of social problems, you know, alcoholism very high and so forth. And there was also a great deal of poor outcomes for children, actually getting in trouble with the law at a very early age, children exhibiting psychological problems more frequently, behavioral problems, things like that. And so, you know, some people say, well, maybe those parents need training how to, you know, discipline their children or something. Well, here's the thing that happened is they discovered oil on the reservation. And so oil companies came in and began mining that oil. And as a result, each family began receiving checks each month that significantly increased their incomes. And interestingly, as the incomes increased, the level of childhood problems, behavioral, emotional, that sort of thing, decreased significantly. And this sort of suggests that, hey, it may not be that the parents don't know what to do, it's dealing with poverty. So I think one of the things we need to do is work to somehow fight poverty. Okay, that's probably the most important thing. The second item that contributes significantly to family dysfunction would be instability. Now, take into account that kids tend to prefer stability. They tend to like to be in the same home and neighborhood, school, as they're used to. And they tend to prefer their family structure to be stable as well, that, you know, mom and dad are there, that we don't have one of them leaving and some other person coming in, that sort of stuff. And so they have preference generally for that. Now they might say, I wish I was in another school, but the reality is you try to take them out of there and they say, oh, and wait a minute, I'm going to work on what about all my friends? Yeah, right. And that's a thing, adult awareness that kids prefer this. Adults often don't take this into account. An adult might, for example, receive a great job offer in another city. And so that adult is all excited. We're going to move to this other city. It's going to be so great. And, you know, we're going to have a new home, new neighborhood, new friends, and a new school. Oh, it's going to be so great. What's the kids? Say, oh my gosh, all the things that I'm used to, gone, right? All my friends gone. Yeah, so that's not taken as well by kids. And we need to take that into account when we're thinking about making significant changes. Now, consider kids who are homeless or refugees. There's no stability in their lives at all, other than maybe they're with their parents if they're lucky. But that can be very difficult. So instability may also appear in frequent relocation. So the family has to move from one place to another. And when this happens, kids tend to have more problems with behavioral problems, emotional problems, and also more problems with school achievement. Okay. And this was something that especially was a concern in military families, and often each time the military parent was assigned to a new post, families would move. Well, it turned out there were significant studies that came out that showed that actually it's probably better for the child to maybe have some temporary separation from the parent rather than constantly relocating temporarily. Okay, so whereas it kind of seemed to make sense that, oh, keep the family together in the same place, even if you got to keep moving around every 6 months to every year. In fact, it turned out that often, yeah, having a stable environment with that family member not being present for a time actually turned out to be better in terms of outcomes for kids. Now, speaking of military families, they've learned a lot about that as they studied that. And so now they're actually, taking steps to help families to kind of stay in the same place more, and also to still have some interaction with that missing family member that might be assigned to a post elsewhere. And they're also working at also trying to uh, keep that stability more. So there's one area where they're actually kind of doing what the research suggests might be beneficial as much as they can. Okay, then family conflict, third factor that significantly increases the likelihood of family dysfunction. In fact, it really is a family dysfunction. And here's one of the reasons is parental conflict often will lead to instability in the family. So that conflict means one parent may simply say eventually, hey, I'm tired of this conflict with you. I'm done. I'm out of here. And that concerns kids. Okay. And so when parents fight with each other, often kids blame themselves. They say, oh, it's my fault. If I just behaved better, they wouldn't be doing that, even though they may have nothing to do with it. That's detrimental. If children then actually are witnessing domestic violence in the home, they are victimized by that, just in almost as if they themselves were physically the victim of that domestic violence. And we see kids who have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, simply from what? Witnessing domestic violence in their home. So this is a very detrimental thing, particularly if it escalates to violence. Now, when this happens, one of the things some kids will do is just look for a way out. And so they may leave the family as soon as possible, maybe even before they're ready. Just to say, I'm going to get the hell out of here as quick as I can. But sometimes they may be jumping in from, from a frying pan to the fire, so to speak, and even ending up in a worse situation by just trying to get out. So family conflict, not good. Kids need a harmonious home life, at least reasonably harmonious and peaceful. So there you go. There are some things regarding all of that, family functioning, middle childhood. The next video, I'll pick up the influence and interaction with the peer group, including things like bullying, and we'll look at moral development as well. So let's call it quits, and hope you're having a great day. Talk to you later.